He had a wife, a daughter who was 9, and a son who was 6. On the morning of March 3, 1987, he drove to work at the insurance brokerage on the 3rd floor of the Elmore Building in Boise, Idaho. Parked his car in the same spot he always parked it, walked through the lobby, and never came up the elevator. His name was Thomas Garfield Meade, and he never came home. That is not a story about a man who walked away from his life. That is a story about what it costs a family when an institution, a single agency, making a single decision in a single year, decides that a husband and father who left behind a car, a briefcase, and 2 children is probably just a man who chose to disappear, and closes the file accordingly, and leaves his wife with nothing for the next 37 years. And it would take 37 years, a forensic genealogist working pro bono out of her living room in Tucson, and a DNA match uploaded to a public ancestry database by a woman who had never heard the name Thomas Meade, to finally tell the truth about what happened to a man whose family never stopped believing he had not chosen to go. But before we get to that truth, and it is darker than the disappearance ever was, we have to go back to Boise in March of 1987. Because to understand what was lost, you first have to understand who Thomas Meade was, and what his family carried in his absence, and why the truth that finally came back to them after 37 years was harder to hold than the not knowing had been. Boise in 1987 was a city in the middle of growing up. The tech sector was beginning to take root in the Treasure Valley. The population had been climbing steadily through the decade, and the downtown had the particular energy of a mid-sized western city that has just realized it is becoming something larger than it thought. It still had the character of the high desert it sat in. Wide streets, low buildings, the Boise Mountains rising to the northeast, the smell of sage on the wind when the air came from the right direction. It was a city where people left their garage doors open and their keys in the car and expected things to be there when they came back. Thomas Meade had lived in Boise for 15 years. He had come from a small town in eastern Oregon called Vail, had gone to Boise State on a partial academic scholarship, had met his wife Patricia at a church social in 1974, and had built a life so consistently and methodically that the people who knew him well used words like steady and grounded and the person you'd call in an emergency when they described him. He was the kind of man who coached his son's t-ball team and attended every school play, and kept a toolbox so organized that Patricia would later tell friends she had found herself going to it for comfort in the months after he disappeared, just to look at the rows of tools in their proper places. He worked for a company called Mountain Western Insurance as a senior broker, a position he had held for 6 years. He was the kind of employee who remembered his colleagues' birthdays and stayed late when a file needed closing, and had never, in the institutional memory of the brokerage, missed a day of work without calling ahead. His supervisor, a woman named Annette Carlisle, would tell police afterward that Thomas Meade's unexplained absence was the most anomalous event in her 11 years of managing that office. He would have called, she said. He always called. His daughter, Kendra, was 9 years old in March 1987, and had her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and was, by her own description given in an interview 37 years later, exactly the kind of child who thinks her father can fix anything. His son Danny was 6 and had just started first grade and still ran to the door when he heard the car in the driveway. Thomas Meade drove a 1985 Buick LeSabre in a dark gray color. He parked it in the garage behind the Elmore Building every morning at 7:45 a.m. and retrieved it every evening between 5:30 and 6 p.m. On March 3, 1987, the car was in the garage at 7:45 a.m. It was still there at 6:30 p.m. when Patricia called the building manager to ask if Thomas was still in the office. The lobby security guard had no record of him going up. He had no record of him coming back down. Thomas Mead had entered the Elmore Building lobby at approximately 7:47 a.m. on March 3, 1987, and had vanished somewhere between the ground floor and the third. Patricia Mead called the Boise Police Department at 7:02 p.m. on March 3, 1987. She was told that a 48-hour waiting period was standard for missing adults before a formal report could be filed. She called again on the morning of March 5th. A detective named Frank Oswald was assigned to the case. He came to the house. He asked the questions detectives ask. He looked at the organized toolbox and the family photographs and the children's drawings on the refrigerator and concluded, based on no evidence, based on a cultural assumption that was common in law enforcement in the 1980s and has since been largely abandoned, that Thomas Mead had walked away voluntarily. The building had no security camera footage. The lobby guard had not seen Thomas after he entered. The elevator had no log. There were fire stairs accessible from the lobby. There was a delivery bay in the back of the building, accessible from a corridor off the main lobby, that opened onto an alley. Any of these might have been how he left. None of them were examined with the rigor the case deserved. The institutional failure was not a single moment, but a posture. An investigative posture that treated a missing father of two with an impeccable work record as a boss voluntary departure and allocated resources accordingly. Detective Oswald interviewed Patricia twice, Thomas's colleagues once, and his sister in Vail by phone. He checked Thomas's bank accounts, one small withdrawal of $200 on February 27th, the last transaction he ever made, which Oswald treated as evidence of planning rather than routine. He checked for other women, found nothing, and seemed disappointed rather than relieved. The case was classified as a voluntary missing adult. It was effectively closed within 6 weeks. Patricia was not told it had been closed. She was simply told there were no new leads and that they would be in touch. Nobody was ever again in touch. Patricia Mead spent the following years doing what the Boise Police Department had not. She hired a private investigator in 1988 who found nothing. She hired another in 1991 who found nothing but charged considerably more. She wrote to the FBI. She wrote to the National Center for Missing Adults, which did not yet exist in 1987, but which she wrote to the moment it was established in 1997. She kept the toolbox organized. She kept Thomas's name on the joint bank account until the bank made her change it in 1994. She did not remarry. She raised Kendra and Danny largely alone, with the help of her sister and Thomas's mother, who died in 2003, still believing her son had chosen to leave and never fully forgiving him for it. By 1995, 8 years had passed. Kendra was 21 and in college in Seattle. Danny was 17 and about to take his driving test in a car that was not his father's Buick, which had sat in the family garage until 1993, and then been sold because Patricia could no longer afford to insure a car she couldn't bring herself to drive. By 2001, 14 years, Patricia still lived in the house on Cottonwood Drive. She had gone back to work in 1990, eventually becoming a legal secretary at a firm downtown, eventually becoming an office manager, eventually building a second version of her adult life in the absence of the first one. The gray Buick's old parking spot in the Elmore Building garage had been numbered and reassigned and parked in by thousands of different people who did not know what had happened there on a March morning in 1987. By 2010, 23 years. Frank Oswald had retired. The detective who technically held the Mead file had never worked it actively. The 48-hour waiting period that had delayed the initial report had been revised out of Boise PD policy in 1994, 7 years after it had failed the Mead family in the most consequential possible way. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, verifying facts, and piecing together lives that deserved better. If you believe that kind of work matters, take a second to like this video and subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get back to Thomas. The case had been sitting for 34 years when a forensic genealogist named Miriam Chen, working pro bono on cold cases through a volunteer program called The Lost Returns, opened the Mead file in 2021. She was 44 years old, lived in Tucson, and had spent 7 years using genealogical DNA methods to identify John and Jane Does in the Southwest. The Mead case was different from her usual work. Thomas was not an unidentified body. He was a man who had simply not come home. But there was evidence in the file that had never been pursued genealogically. A partial DNA profile had been extracted from biological material recovered from the lobby of the Elmore Building during the initial 1987 investigation. Not Thomas's DNA, but an unknown profile, collected from a surface near the building's fire exit door and never matched. It had been preserved. In 2021, partial profiles could be uploaded to genealogical databases in ways that 1987 investigators could not have imagined. Miriam Chen uploaded the unknown profile to GEDmatch, a public ancestry database where users voluntarily submit their DNA for matching. The process works by identifying distant relatives of the unknown contributor, second and third cousins, whose family trees can then be built outward until a plausible candidate emerges. It is the same technique used to identify the Golden State Killer. It takes patience, lateral thinking, and the willingness to build family trees for people you have never met. Chen worked the case for 11 months. She built 14 family trees. She narrowed the candidate list to 3 men. She forwarded the 3 names to a detective at the Boise PD Cold Case Unit named Sergeant Marcus Webb, who had been assigned the Mead file after the department launched a formal cold case review in 2020. The 3 names arrived in Webb's inbox on a Tuesday morning in January 2022. He read through them. The second name stopped him cold. The second name was a man named Carl Dietrich Prewitt. Prewitt was 68 years old in 2022. He had lived in Boise from 1983 to 1990. He had been 49 in 1987 when Thomas Mead disappeared. He had subsequently moved to Portland, then to Sacramento, then to a small community in northern Nevada where he had been living quietly and without notable incident since 2004. He had no criminal record. He had no history of violence that any database contained. He was, in the way the framework demands be named before the mask comes off, entirely unremarkable. What records showed? Prewitt had worked as a delivery contractor in 1987, with a regular route that included the Elmore Building. His access card, issued by the building management company, had been used to open the delivery bay door on the morning of March 3, 1987, at 7:51 a.m., 4 minutes after Thomas Mead entered the lobby. That access card record had been in the building management company's log in 1987. It had not been subpoenaed. It had not been requested. Detective Oswald had not asked for delivery contractor access records because he had classified the case as a voluntary departure before he thought to look. A warrant for Prewitt's DNA was obtained in March 2022. The match was confirmed by the Idaho State Forensic Laboratory on April 14, 2022. The profile recovered from the fire exit door in 1987 was Carl Dietrich Prewitt's. He was arrested at his home in Nevada on April 29, 2022. He did not say he had figured this day would come. He said nothing at all. He stood in his doorway in the gray Nevada morning and looked at the 2 detectives on his step and said nothing, and was handcuffed and was placed in the car. And the neighbors who came to their windows saw a 68-year-old man in a bathrobe being walked to a police vehicle without resistance and without apparent surprise. During the investigation that followed, Prewitt's history was excavated with a thoroughness that Thomas Mead's disappearance had never received in 1987. What investigators found: Prewitt had a documented history of financial disputes and a pattern of behavior across multiple states that had, in each instance, stopped just short of criminal record. He had left Boise suddenly in late 1990. He had left Portland suddenly in 1997. He was, in the language investigators used in their report, a man who moved when things became uncomfortable and relied on the distance to provide him what contrition could not. The specific truth about what happened in the Elmore building on the morning of March 3, 1987, what Thomas Mead encountered in the corridor between the lobby and the fire exit, and what Carl Prewitt did and why, emerged over 8 months of pre-trial investigation and was presented in court in the spring of 2023. It was darker than the disappearance. The title promised that. The title was right. Thomas Mead had encountered Prewitt in the corridor near the delivery bay, apparently interrupting a theft from the building's management office. The evidence established a confrontation. It established that Thomas Mead had not left that building alive. It established that Prewitt had spent 35 years moving between states, building surface-level lives of ordinary respectability, while Thomas Mead's family spent those same years in the specific and prolonged agony of not knowing. Prewitt was convicted of first-degree murder in October 2023. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Thomas Mead's remains have not been fully recovered. Investigators, using information developed during the trial, located a partial recovery in the Boise foothills in the fall of 2023. The recovery was incomplete. It was enough for identification. It was enough for a burial. Patricia Mead was 80 years old when Sergeant Marcus Webb called her on an April evening in 2022 to tell her that a DNA match had been made and an arrest was coming. She had been waiting for that call, in one form or another, for 35 years. She had not stopped believing it would come. She had raised 2 children in the house on Cottonwood Drive and kept the toolbox organized and outlived a theory about her husband that was wrong from the beginning, and she had been right. She said to Webb before he could finish his sentence, "You found him, didn't you?" Not a question. Kendra Mead was 46 years old when the arrest was made public. She had spent her adult life in Seattle, working as a school counselor, a career choice she has described in terms that do not mention her father, and that everyone who knows her understands completely. Danny Mead was 41. He drove to Boise from Portland the night the arrest was announced and sat in the living room of the house on Cottonwood Drive with his mother and his sister and did not, by any of their accounts, say very much. There are things that 37 years of not knowing does to a family that a verdict cannot undo. The children who ran to the door when they heard the car, they are in their 40s now, with lives that were built entirely in the absence of their father. And the truth that finally arrived did not give him back. It gave them the knowledge of what happened, which is a different thing, and which is both less than what they deserved and more than the 37 years of nothing that preceded it. The toolbox is still organized. Patricia has said she will not move it. She has said it still looks exactly the way he left it. And that this is the thing about Thomas that she wants people to know. Not the way he died, not the 37 years, but the way he organized a toolbox, every tool in its place, everything as he had left it. A small, precise record of a man who meant to come home. There are missing adults in this country, men and women who vanished without violence-coded evidence, who were classified as voluntary departures in an era when that classification cost almost nothing for an institution and everything for a family. Some of them chose to leave. Some of them did not. The DNA tools that found Thomas Mead exist right now. The databases exist. The volunteer genealogists exist. What is sometimes missing is the file being opened, the evidence being re-examined, the partial profile from 1987 being uploaded to a database that wasn't available until 2021. Thomas Mead was in that database. He had been waiting there, in a partial profile from a fire exit door in the Elmore building, for 35 years. The toolbox is in the same garage on Cottonwood Drive. Organized. Every tool in its place. Justice found Thomas Mead after 37 years. It found him in the form of a DNA match in a database, and a conviction and a truth that is harder to hold than a mystery. If you believe truth is worth pursuing no matter what it costs, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved stories are waiting in the description below. Thank you for watching.